Greetings and welcome to the pod. My name is Mark West. Associate Professor Anna Clark is an ocean lover, fisher and historian at the University of Technology, Sydney. She has extensively researched the history of beach culture in Australia, an important place for thousands of generations of Indigenous culture, a place of last resort during the Great Depression, and a place of upheaval during the more recent Cronulla riots. And throughout all that time, it has been vital for food and industry. I started by asking Anna about her connection to the ocean.
Oh, wow, what does the beach mean to me? There's so many things. I feel really nostalgic when I think about the beach because it reminds me of my childhood and people who died in my family who showed me how to fish and fossick and snorkel. But it also makes me feel very present in that kind of mindfulness sense. I really crave going to the beach and being in the water as a way of sort of, I guess, reconnecting with the world. Weirdly, because I guess it's otherworldly in many respects when you're snorkeling and swimming in it. But I love the way the beach, both when you're walking along it or fishing or swimming in it, sort of takes you out of whatever things are going on in your life and just puts you very, very much in the present moment of the natural world. It's really restorative.
Have you always felt like that, or is that more of a recent feeling?
I think so. Yeah, I think I have. From a very early age, I was I bought a snorkel mask when I was really young. As soon as I could have pocket money. And I always loved sort of sticking my head in a little rock pool, or as I got bigger and more confident, swimming out a bit further and seeing what was under the water. And I've also always, from a very young age, loved fishing. And it's not necessarily something that lots of little kids like because there's a lot of quiet in fishing and a lot of nothing happening. But I've always really enjoyed just sitting and, watching the tide turn or watching a kingfisher fly past or a fish jumping. I've always found it really a great kind of pastime, an important one too.
Do you get much time for that these days?
Yeah, I think I do. I have managed to work part-time, which is great, so I always have time in the week when kids are at school for me to be able to go off and have a snorkel or a fish or a paddle on the water. Worth every cent that I'm not earning to be able to go off and do that.
Where do you go?
Well, I live in Sydney. We live in Sydney, my family. So I usually go somewhere close to the city, around Gordons Bay or Shelley Beach in Manly, or around Botany Bay has some lovely places to snorkel or fish for squid. Yeah, but then on in the holidays I usually head down the south coast of New South Wales, where my grandparents' old farm is, and we sort of camp there, and it's by the beach, so spend all our days camping and fishing and swimming, which is a beautiful way to spend the school holidays.
A lovely way to spend school holidays. And you couldn't do it last year because of the bushfires, I guess, but this year at least you got to do that.
Yeah, well, we were actually living there last year when the bushfires were coming, so we had to evacuate, which was very terrifying. And the reminders of that awful time are all around us still when we go down to the beach, because there's still, black leaves washing up on the water. But it's been lovely to go back these past few months and spend lots of time again there after the drought. It's really sort of wet and it feels like the bush is really coming back to life. And with in the midst of the COVID pandemic, it's actually great to be able to go somewhere in the natural world and just, the fish don't care that there's a pandemic, and the birds and the kangaroos don't either. It's very kind of restorative to be in a place where the world goes on, the natural world goes on at least, even though we are often caught up with what's going on in our kind of global lives.
Your academic research, you've done a lot of research into the history of fishing and the beach in Australia. I guess that's, did you come to that because of your love of fishing and beach and the natural world?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm studied history at university and gone on to become a history teacher myself at university. And my area of research has been, until quite recently, it's been about Australian history and I guess the politics and the contests of Australian history. Why Australian history is why people disagree about it so much, or why there's a movement for changing the date of Australia Day and so on. I'm really fascinated by those debates about Australian history. But my secret passion, which is not so secret now, of course, is swimming and fishing and the ocean. And I've been trying to redirect my professional interest towards my personal ones, which is slowly coming together. I'm very happy to say.
That's perfect. And I read your article in the conversation about the history of sort of the beach in Australia, which I thought was really fascinating. And I've always found it really interesting that there was a period of time where the beach wasn't a particularly desired spot. We would dump sewage and all the rest of it off there, and it wasn't the fancy location that it is now. I'd be interested in hearing what you think about that and the different views of the beach over time.
Yeah, I think for a long time the beach was more inclined to be seen as a resource, that you might extract things from it, like fish, for example, or use it as a dumping ground, as you say. And that's not to say that people didn't connect with it or love being at the beach, but definitely there was more a sense of it being a resource that you could exploit. And I suppose for a lot of the 19th century in Australia in particular, a lot of people weren't necessarily Australian born. I'm talking about the non-Indigenous population here. And so they didn't kind of connect with the Australian landscape in the same way as their children and grandchildren. And when they thought of a comforting landscape, it might have been a landscape from Europe or England. And it took several generations for, I suppose, people to be born here and think about home as being here, and to think about the landscape around them as something that might be of interest and even special. And that coincided, I guess, troublingly also with the sort of the moving off of Aboriginal people from traditional country around the cities in particular. So, the beaches in Sydney, for example, and the national parks immediately around Sydney became not only of interest for Australian-born, white Australian-born citizens, but they also became seen as sort of safe because Aboriginal people had been moved off country for the most part. So a lot of Australians, I guess, began to connect with this natural world, which has given us great sort of, I think a lot of Australian identity comes from the bush and from the beach, but I think it's really important to be mindful that the flip side of this connectedness to the beach happened because other people were sort of taken away from it, so that white Australia, or certainly non-Indigenous Australia, could come to terms with the landscape they were in.
That was an interesting point that I'd never actually considered, that the Royal National Park, which is a big, massive park in Sydney and one of the first places in the world to to be declared national park, it's you immediately think, oh, that's a good thing, but of course it meant that it was excluding the original inhabitants from the area, and I hadn't thought of that before, and it is a really interesting two sides to that coin that you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worthwhile, understanding that so much of Australian history is that two sides. And it doesn't mean, like you said, it doesn't mean that the national park is bad. It's this incredible resource that we should all be really grateful for. But at the same time, it is really important to think about the historical context of these places and this country that we connect to, whether that's sea or land, and that it was other people's before it was colonised. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that non-Indigenous Australians can't feel connected to it, because so many do, and I'm one of them. I absolutely feel I feel deeply connected to a lot of the Australian country, but I think we do have to remember and be mindful of where it has come from and where we have come from as a nation as well.
You mentioned some really interesting things about the Indigenous history with the beach, with the middens and up in Weipa. I don't have a great deal of knowledge of like what ancient middens are. Could you tell me what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so a lot of the sort of archaeological understandings of ancient Aboriginal societies and culture, they come from oral histories, of course, and from material culture, like objects that are passed on through the ages, and art, and also these things we call middens. And middens are, I guess they're like time capsules, but over time, like a longitudinal time capsule where what people have been eating and doing in terms of making implements and eating food. Midden means literally like the cast off. So it's what people left behind. And these often have been accumulated over time. So thousands and thousands of years, people have camped, Aboriginal communities have camped by various places, and had a feed of mussels or chipped some stones to make implements and tools. But every year or every season, these middens have been added to in turn. And in some places, for example, in Weipa in North Queensland, some middens are up to 20 metres high. So you can imagine just how many years people have been going there, and the sort of knowledge of that area that must be accumulated over that amount of time. And in a number of places, for example, around Port Phillip Bay, Matthew Flinders, when he sailed into Port Phillip Bay in the early 1800s during his circumnavigation of Australia, one of the notes he made in his diary was this huge build-up of shells around Port Phillip Bay, and that was partly shells that washed up in storms, but it was also middens, and they were mud oysters that people had been sort of eating for thousands of years on the banks of Port Phillip Bay. And then when Port Phillip Bay became settled and colonised and increasingly built up, those middens were actually dug up and burnt to make lime for the mortar to make the buildings of Melbourne. So there's this kind of extraordinary, I suppose, historical trace that starts with Aboriginal people, being in the water and diving for oysters, and then creating these enormous middens on the bay that are then in turn dug up by the next sort of wave of colonists and burnt to make the buildings of one civilization that was basically, expropriating the land of another.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's thousands of years of shells, and then it's all lost in such a short period of time.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the important thing about a lot of these Aboriginal archives, like Middens and art galleries and oral oral histories, is that they really have accumulated so much knowledge of country, and um, we, in our attempts, it feels like this moment in Australian history with the Uluru Statement from the Heart and so on. And things like, I'm aware of this having lived through the bushfires last year on the South Coast. There's a sort of a belated recognition that there might be really important knowledge in that, in those Indigenous understandings of country, and that it's only now that I think a lot of non-Indigenous people are sort of thinking about what that means and what that might mean for living in Australia and in the Australian landscape sustainably. What aspects of Aboriginal knowledges does the broader Australian population need to sort of take on meaningfully in order to live here sustainably?
Oh, I mean, there's clearly so many things that we could learn about bushfire or bush management and all the rest of it. And the idea that Australia wasn't covered in bush, it was actually managed for however many thousands of years. There's a lot to learn there.
And fisheries too, no doubt.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about the fisheries as well. I mean, that you hear stories of, the amount of fish that were off the coast, and being able to just put your hand in at Bondi and grab a fish, or the amazing kelp forests of Tasmania and whatnot. There's the coast and the fisheries have changed so much.
Absolutely, and obviously, sustaining sort of sporadic populations of Aboriginal communities is not the same thing as a large industrialised economy of 25 million people. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from those knowledges and what it means to treat the ocean as a resource that will keep on sustaining us.
You mentioned a really interesting tidbit I wanted to ask you about, talking about Indigenous oral histories and the north coast of Queensland and what's now the seabed for the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah, there's incredible accounts both around the Great Barrier Reef and also in Port Phillip Bay in Victoria. There are Aboriginal oral histories of their inundation. So that's about 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. The ice caps melted and the sea levels rose by, several hundred metres. And so the coast of Australia was much further out, and the Great Barrier Reef was not there. The coast was further out, obviously, and in Port Phillip Bay, for example, the bay wasn't there. It was just a river valley, and the Yarra River essentially flowed right out through what's now Port Phillip Bay, out through the heads to where the ocean was. And there are actually Aboriginal oral histories. I was reading an account from a guy in the 1840s who was travelling through Port Phillip Bay, for example, and he said that there are testimony in the district from Aboriginal people who could account for and told stories of the inundation of Port Phillip Bay, and the same goes for what is now the area where the Great Barrier Reef is. That there are actually oral histories of the water coming up and what that means. And so if you think about, what our knowledge, sort of modern Australian knowledge of, I guess the coast is a few hundred years old. It's just almost impossible to compute what it might mean to have a knowledge of the ocean and the coast that stretches back thousands of years, literally. It's an extraordinary thing to comprehend. To me, it's like looking up at the stars and thinking that there might be billions of stars up there. Like, it's kind of almost impossible to understand what it means to actually have histories and knowledge that stretch back into deep time like that.
And in one of your articles, you mentioned something really interesting about how it was thought that lorikeets appearing at a particular time of the year would indicate that there was a particularly good sea catch at another time of the year. How it was all connected, and how all those stories kind of made that case.
Yeah, that's right. So as well as that, I guess that's what that extensive and deep time history enables the accumulation of really detailed knowledge about how the natural systems in Australia are interconnected. And when I was researching for my history of fishing book, I was reading a lot of, colonial journals and sources of explorers' journals, really. And they were sort of walking up and down the coast and meeting Aboriginal groups and relating extraordinary sort of accounts from Aboriginal communities about when certain things would appear, like the example you gave, when the rainbow lorikeets appeared in the mountains, it means the mullet would be running, or when a certain wattle appeared in flower, then it would mean that the prawns would be about to appear in the Shoalhaven River. And, that kind of incredibly, I suppose, detailed knowledge of the natural world and the landscapes is just, is very profound, and it's also quite moving because it seems so far away from the ways we inhabit. Certainly, the way I inhabit Australia. It would be incredible to have that knowledge, I think.
In the Depression, people were forced to go to the beach because they couldn't live anywhere else, couldn't afford it, needed to go to fish there. It was I guess it was a working place, but it was also a place of last resort in a way.
Yeah, that's right. There's sort of amazing stories of all around Australia during the Great Depression when, unemployment was up to 30% in some areas and in some occupations, and people were, desperate. There's no sort of JobKeeper going on then, and for a number of people who were driven to sort of desperation and starvation, they ended up moving into these kind of shanty communities by the coast because they could always fish. It's sort of been this retreat, and when it's interesting actually reading some of the oral histories from this period. Obviously, like you said, they're forced to. It's a place of last resort. And a place of sort of a decision forced by desperation, really, where people would go and catch fish, both for their families, but then also to be able to barter for other things that they needed. But in the oral histories themselves, they also really reveal a great kind of connectedness to the ocean. And although it was a really tough time in many respects, and these were unemployed people with no money and sort of building little shacks out of driftwood, and stones from the ocean, they remembered the time as being very kind of basic but fulfilling, and that living according to the tides and the swell and the weather was kind of restorative at some level, as well as despite the reasons why they had been forced there.
And I guess the other time of unrest in the beach, at least in my mind, is in more recent times with the Cronulla riots, but that's a different reason. Do you think that the beach is just a coincidence that was based around that, or do you think there's kind of a deeper?
I think it's probably a deeper kind of more disturbing element in that particular conflict, where I guess, like we were talking about earlier, the beach was taken off traditional owners by colonial Australians. People have often been moved off the beach in Australian history, and so that sense of entitlement and who owns the beach is not necessarily straightforward or fair or clear cut. And when there is, a sense of, I suppose, racist elements of what Australian identity is, and if there's a kind of a stereotype of the blonde, bronzed Australian on the beach, that's actually a really exclusive kind of mythos, I suppose, because it's sort of implying that the beach is for some people, but maybe not for everyone. And and I think Australian history shows that to be the case. That there is this sort of Australian identity is based on these kind of lots of positive elements of feeling connected to the landscape and being outdoors and reveling in this kind of freedom that might not have been possible, in other places in Europe and the UK where people have come from. But at the same time, it is kind of it can be exclusive and it can be excluding, and that if you don't sort of fit into that conforming narrative, then you're kind of excluded from it. And I think all of those things contributed to the Cronulla riots. It's a sort of a disturbing element of Australian national identity, I think, that hasn't been resolved, and possibly, speaking with my historian's hat on, possibly sort of reaches back into that sort of colonising time of people being moved off.
What's next in your for your research? Is this an area of active research, or are you looking more into other areas of Australian history next?
I would love to keep researching in sort of environmental history around the beach and the ocean. I don't know if that's possible. The vagaries of funding and research funding and so on. But absolutely, I have had so much fun combining my two passions of fishing and beaching with my professional expertise. So I would love to keep going in this area. I think it's the great thing about environmental history is that you're able to tell so much just by describing the place itself, and then also the place itself is able to carry so much of the story because it can hold contrasting interpretations and different generations over time. I think it's a really rich sort of setting to be doing Australian history. So I'd love to keep going in this area if I could.
And do you swim much yourself when you go fishing? Do you jump in the water, or is it strictly boat?
I do, absolutely. Yeah, I do. I love swimming in the ocean, and particularly snorkeling in the ocean. It just takes me out of the cerebral, research, archival writing lands that academic history kind of entails, and takes me to somewhere that's, really beautiful.
And what do you think where will be your next holiday then? Back down the South Coast? Or I guess we're kind of stuck in New South Wales at the moment, aren't we?
We're stuck in New South Wales, aren't we? So I think so. I'm hoping to do I've done a little bit of research out in Brewarrina in far western New South Wales, so I hope to go back there soon. And we've booked to drive up to the Great Barrier Reef and snorkel there in July if we can, fingers crossed. But in the meantime, we'll be hugging the New South Wales coast, no doubt, and jumping in whenever we can.
Do the inland lakes and rivers hold the same appeal?
As a historian, they do for me, but I guess because I haven't grown up in the inland, I don't feel so, I don't feel so connected in that way. I don't know the fishing or the walking as I do along the coast. But that's something I'm getting better at, and will hope to continue fostering that connection over time.
Thank you very much to Anna Clark for that fascinating historical tour of Australian beach culture. If you'd like to dive into anything you heard in this episode, please get over to the website at www.thepodpodcast.net. That's www.thepodpodcast.net, and from there you can find links to Anna's work. Thanks again. My name's Mark West. I'll catch you next time on The Pod.